the countryside north of Rome, along the route of the ancient Via Tiberina, archaeologists clearing ground for a new stretch of highway in 1962 uncovered a single estate with two structures standing only a short walk apart. The discovery was accidental. Construction crews building an access ramp for the motorway, close to the ancient sanctuary of Lucus Feronii, cut directly into the buried complex before archaeologists were able to intervene. One was a peristyle court, a colonnaded garden lined with marble portrait busts of 3 generations of Roman consuls, its floors finished in imported stone and mosaic. The other was a row of roughly 30 small rooms with floors of bare rock, built according to an inscription found at a household shrine beside them, to hold no fewer than 500 enslaved men and women. Both structures belonged to the same family, stood inside the same boundary wall, and were in use at the same time. This reconstruction centers on the decades around 79 AD, when a fall of volcanic ash from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius sealed several Roman villas on the Bay of Naples in the condition they were in on the day they were abandoned, preserving everything from painted plaster to carbonized food and, in one case, an entire library of papyrus scrolls. It also draws on evidence spanning the final 2 centuries of the Roman Republic and the first 2 centuries of the Empire, the period during which villa estates reached their greatest number across the Italian peninsula. The sources include the excavated villas at Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Oplontis, the household letters of the senator Pliny the Younger, 3 surviving manuals on estate management written by landowners named Cato, Varro, and Columella, and modern excavations of working farm estates such as Setta Finestra in Tuscany and the villa belonging to the Volusius family north of Rome. By the 1st century of the empire, the villa had become the standard form taken by landed wealth across Roman Italy. The system had its roots 2 centuries earlier, in the years following the war against the Carthaginian general Hannibal, when Roman farmers spent over a decade away from their land fighting and returned to fields that had fallen into ruin or been seized for unpaid debt. Wealthy buyers consolidated these small holdings into larger estates, a process that accelerated again after the dictatorship of Sulla in the 80s BC, when land confiscated from his political enemies entered the market in large quantities at low prices. Within a few generations, a peninsula once dominated by independent smallholders supported what Roman writers themselves called latifundia, estates of several dozen to several hundred hectares, worked not by free tenant farmers, but by purchased and inherited labor. The senator Cicero is recorded as having owned as many as 7 villas across Italy during his lifetime. Pliny the Younger held 3 or 4, including a house on the coast at Laurentum, which he called with calculated modesty his little villa despite its evident scale, and a second property in the hills of Umbria. On the Bay of Naples, the so-called Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, possibly built for the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law, stretched more than 250 meters along the shoreline and held a private library of over 1,800 papyrus scrolls, the only library to survive complete from the entire Greek and Roman world. A short distance away at Oplontis, a similarly large seaside villa is linked by some historians, though not conclusively, to Poppaea Sabina, the second wife of the Emperor Nero. Thousands of estates of more ordinary size were distributed along the road network radiating out from Rome and along the coasts of Campania, supplying the capital and the legions on the frontiers with wheat, olive oil, and wine, the 3 staples Roman writers grouped together as the products of the land. Writers on agriculture, beginning with Cato in the 2nd century BC, described the ideal estate as divided into 3 connected sections. The pars urbana was the residential section, reserved for the owner and his family. The pars rustica was the working section, housing the agricultural staff alongside their tools and draft animals. The pars fructuaria stored and processed what the land produced in pressing rooms for olives and grapes and in cellars lined with buried clay storage jars holding well over 1,000 liters apiece. A single roofline could cover all 3 sections on a smaller farm, but on the larger estates the boundary was marked by separate entrances and by a difference in floor level between the owner's wing and the working wing. That separation rested on a legal foundation. Roman law classified an enslaved person as property rather than as a legal person, in the same category as a plow ox, a cart, or a set of tools, and that classification had direct and sometimes lethal consequences. In 61 AD, a city prefect named Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered inside his own house by one of his slaves. Roman custom, formalized 2 generations earlier into a decree known as the Senatus Consultum Silanianum, held that if a master was killed by a slave, every slave living under his roof was to be executed, on the reasoning that all of them shared responsibility for failing to prevent or report the crime. Pedanius owned 400 slaves. Even after the individual killer was identified, the Senate, urged on by the former consul Gaius Cassius Longinus, voted to carry out the execution of the entire household, including children, over public protests that brought soldiers into the streets of Rome to enforce the sentence. The same legal logic, applied at a smaller scale, shaped the architecture of ordinary working estates, where agricultural writers described a structure called the ergastulum, quarters built partly below ground or lit only through high, narrow openings, entered by a single controlled doorway, and used specifically to confine enslaved laborers in chains. For the owner of a villa, the building served a purpose that a townhouse in Rome itself could not. A senator, or a wealthy equestrian living in the capital, was expected to rise before sunrise and receive a procession of clients in the entrance hall of his house, a daily ritual called the salutatio, often beginning before the household had eaten its own simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and fruit. Dressed in togas, the clients waited in the atrium for their turn to greet their patron, who in return might offer advice, settle a dispute, or hand out a small daily allowance of food or coin known as the sportula. The number of clients filing through the door each morning was itself a public measure of a man's standing, and once the greetings were finished, the patron walked to the forum with his clients trailing behind him, continuing the same display in the open street. The villa was where this obligation could be set aside. Pliny the Younger wrote that he kept his house at Laurentum specifically so that he could read and write without interruption, 17 Roman miles from the city, close enough to finish a day's business in Rome and still reach the coast before nightfall. Pliny's letters describe that house room by room in enough detail that architects have used them since to attempt a reconstruction of its floor plan. A visitor entered through a plain courtyard into an atrium with rounded ends, past rooms used for dining and for receiving guests, and reached sleeping rooms positioned to receive the morning sun. Behind the main rooms stood Pliny's library, built into a curved recess and fitted along one wall with shelving for the books he read and reread. A private bath suite included an undressing room, a heated sweating room, a room for applying scented oil, and a warm pool large enough to swim in while looking out over the sea. None of that heat reached the rooms without labor. The system warming the floors and walls, known as a hypocaust, raised the floor on short stacked pillars of tile and circulated hot air from a furnace through the gap underneath and through flues built into the walls themselves. Keeping a hypocaust running required a person to feed and tend its furnace for as long as the rooms above needed heat, a task ancient sources describe as expensive enough that the system was found chiefly in large villas and public bathhouses rather than ordinary homes. Pliny also describes withdrawing each December to a separate garden annex at this house during the festival of the Saturnalia, when the rest of the residents filled with the noise of his household's enslaved staff marking their own celebrations. He wrote that the arrangement suited everyone. He could keep reading and writing undisturbed, and his household could mark the one stretch of the Roman calendar in which its ordinary hierarchy was formally set aside. Pliny's second villa in the hills of Umbria was the property he said he preferred above all his others for the privacy it offered him. Roof tiles bearing his family's initials identify the site, which stayed in occupied use into the 4th century and passed into imperial ownership after Pliny's own death in 113 AD. An inscription found there names a freedwoman, Plinia Cresti, confirming that Pliny had personally granted at least one enslaved member of his household legal freedom. The bath suite at this house was arranged in a sequence of rising heat beyond the cold pool, with a ball court built directly above the undressing room and a garden laid out in the long oval shape of a racetrack. The bath came in the early afternoon, once the morning's business was finished, and the main meal of the day followed it in the evening. Dinner, the cena, was eaten in a room called the triclinium, named for the 3 couches arranged around a low table, each couch built to hold 3 diners reclining on their left side. 9 guests was the standard number for an ordinary dinner, though a large banquet in the city might seat 20 across several adjoining rooms. Guests removed their sandals at the entrance and had their feet washed by a household slave before reclining, then had their hands washed again with scented water once they were in place, since most food was eaten without utensils. The meal proceeded in 3 stages, opening with a light course of appetizers and honeyed wine, continuing through 1 or more main courses, and closing with fruit or a sweet dish. Wine was mixed with water at the table to each guest's preference, since drinking it undiluted was considered a sign of poor self-control. Throughout the meal, slaves carried each course from the kitchen, carved meat in front of the guests, announced new arrivals by name, and in some households performed music or recited poetry between courses, all of them standing since reclining at the table was a privilege reserved for free citizens. The labor that supported a household of this kind operated at a scale modern readers tend to underestimate. Pliny the Younger, whose letters present him as an unusually humane master, one who allowed his slaves to write legally binding wills and who described real grief over the illness of a freedman, is nonetheless estimated by historians to have owned several hundred enslaved people across his properties, a figure roughly in line with men of his rank, like Pedanius Secundus with his 400. At the upper end of the scale, Pliny the Younger's uncle, the elder Pliny, recorded in his natural history the will of a freedman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, a man who had once been enslaved himself, who in 8 BC left behind 4,116 slaves, 3,600 pairs of oxen, and 257,000 head of other livestock, with only 100,000 sesterces set aside for his own funeral alone. War supplied much of this labor force throughout the Republic. After a single siege during Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, the entire surviving population of one captured town, numbering 53,000 people, was sold immediately to slave dealers waiting nearby. Modern historians estimate that enslaved people made up somewhere between roughly 1/5 and 1/3 of the entire population of Italy during this period, with the heaviest concentration found on agricultural estates exactly like these. Cato's manual, written around 160 BC and considered the oldest complete work of Latin prose to survive, recommended a working farm of around 200 jugera, close to 50 hectares, planted mainly in vineyards, which Cato ranked as the single most profitable use of land available to a Roman owner. It set out instructions addressed to a villicus, the enslaved overseer who managed an estate on the owner's behalf, and to the villica, his counterpart responsible for the household's internal economy. The villica rose before the rest of the staff, supervised the grinding of grain and the baking of bread, managed the preserving of fruit and the storage of wine and oil, and oversaw the spinning and weaving of wool into the household's clothing. Cato fixed monthly food rations for field laborers at close to 4 modii of wheat, supplemented with cheap olives or salted fish, with wine rations that rose during the grape harvest, and were deliberately reduced whenever a slave fell sick. On days set aside as holidays, when no field work was permitted, the overseer was still instructed to find tasks, cleaning ditches, mending tools, grinding grain by hand. Cato's most quoted instruction concerned what to do with a worker who could no longer keep pace. Landowners were advised to hold a regular sale of whatever had become surplus to the farm's needs, a list that included worn-out oxen, old tools, a damaged cart, and in the same sentence an old slave or a sickly one. The owner's rooms and the workers' rooms were connected by ordinary doorways and corridors, but the two halves of the same building were rarely visible to each other. A passage from the kitchen, the coulina, typically a small smoke-blackened room set near the latrine and the service entrance so that smoke and odor stayed away from the dining rooms, led directly into the working yard, and from the yard into the enclosed quarters built for the agricultural staff. At the villa of the Volusius family, the ergastulum contained roughly 30 rooms of similar size, their floors cut from bare rock, arranged around their own small courtyard. One room did not match this pattern. It was larger than the rest and finished with a mosaic floor, an altar, and a stone seat, evidently set aside for an overseer, or used for the household's record-keeping rather than for sleeping. A latrine stood at one corner of the complex, and along one side ran a row of 50 small washing closets, the only sanitary provision recorded for the estate's enslaved population. Excavators also found, attached to the same quarters, a household shrine maintained by and for the enslaved staff themselves. evidence that religious practice extended even to the lowest level of the household hierarchy. At Setafinestra, comparable barracks-style quarters housed up to 50 individuals in rooms that excavators have compared directly to slave housing recorded on plantations in the 19th century American South, a comparison the project's original director used explicitly to help identify which excavated rooms had served as living quarters in the first place. Under the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, that same estate was converted further. Its guest apartments became the residence of an imperial estate manager, new bathing facilities were built for the household, and the slave quarters were enlarged again alongside a new piggery, turning a property once built around its owner's leisure into one run almost entirely for production. Ancient writers note that not every enslaved worker lived in these central quarters. Herders, shepherds, and those who tended the poultry slept instead near the animals in their care, scattered across the property rather than confined to a single building. What connected the two halves of the estate was the produce moving between them. Olives were crushed in a press room called the Herculaneum, its stone weights and channels designed to extract oil in measured stages. Grapes were processed nearby, and the resulting wine stored in the buried clay jars of the pars fructuaria, where the surrounding earth kept the temperature stable through fermentation. Some coastal villas maintained vivaria, artificial fish ponds stocked with species such as moray eels, adding a luxury food source and a separate stream of income. At Setafinestra, wine was the estate's primary commercial product. Moved a short distance to the port town of Cosa along the Via Aurelia, the road that had connected the region to Rome since the 3rd century BC, and from there, shipped by sea to markets around the Mediterranean. The same fire that heated Pliny's bathwater and the same labor that pressed a neighboring estate's olives were part of a single economic system. The surplus produced by the working half of the villa funded the comfort of the residential half, and the residential half, through ownership, controlled the labor that produced the surplus. The villa was therefore two things built into the same set of walls. It was a home, furnished with libraries, heated pools, and dining rooms designed for entertainment, and it was an instrument for extracting agricultural surplus from forced labor, furnished with rationed grain, locked doors, and in some cases, literal chains. Roman law, Roman architecture, and Roman household management were not separate systems that happened to coexist on the same property. Each one reinforced the other, and the comfort visible in the archaeological record on one side of the property line existed because of the labor confined on the other. The system that produced these estates did not end abruptly. Its decline tracked the slower collapse of the Western Roman Empire across the 4th and 5th centuries, as the breakdown of central government disrupted the trade networks that had carried a villa's surplus to market, and as the supply of newly enslaved war captives, never entirely reliable, grew scarcer. The process was uneven. In Britain, villa estates were abandoned, stripped, and in some cases burned within a generation of Roman administration withdrawing in the early 5th century. In parts of Italy, the same buildings remained occupied for centuries longer, their grand reception rooms gradually repurposed for storage or stripped of marble, their mosaic floors sometimes torn out to make room for grain-drying ovens. Even before full collapse, owners in exposed regions added defensive walls and watchtowers to buildings that had been designed a few generations earlier, around open colonnades and unobstructed garden views, turning the same architectural skill once used to separate luxury from confinement toward keeping outsiders off the property altogether. Many surviving villa complexes across the former empire were eventually donated to the Christian church and converted into monasteries, a transformation that preserved the physical buildings even as their original economic function disappeared. In parts of post-Roman Britain, the underlying form of the self-sufficient agricultural estate survived under a new name, the vill, worked by inhabitants who, where they remained legally bound to the land they farmed, were known as villeins, a word descended directly from the Latin villa. 2,000 years later, the estate north of Rome where this reconstruction began still holds the physical remains of both halves of that arrangement, the broken marble busts of 3 generations of consuls around its peristyle, and, a short walk away, a row of bare rock floors that once confined 500 people whose names were never recorded anywhere on the property.